The Texas sun hung low over the endless plains, casting long shadows across the Double Bar Ranch. 20,000 acres of prime cattle land stretched toward the horizon, where the sky met the earth in a perfect line of amber and gold. But for all its beauty, the ranch felt more like a fortress than a home. Jeremiah Iron Jack Sullivan stood on his porch, weathered hands gripping the wooden railing as he surveyed his domain. At 58, he was still an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. The deep lines etched into his face told stories of harsh winters, brutal summers, and battles both won and lost. "Boss," called out Miguel, his foreman, approaching with cautious steps. Even after 15 years working the ranch, Miguel still treated his employer with the respect reserved for a sleeping rattlesnake. "The Henderson boy is at the gate again. Says his pa sent him to ask about buying some cattle." Jack's jaw tightened. "Tell him what I told his pa last week, and the week before that. We don't sell to neighbors. We don't trade with neighbors. And we sure as hell don't invite them in for coffee." Miguel nodded, used to delivering such messages. "Yes, sir. But boss, the boy looks pretty desperate. Says their herd got hit hard by that fever last month. Not my problem." Jack's voice carried the finality of a judge's gavel. "Close the gate behind him, Miguel, and make sure it stays closed." As Miguel walked away, Jack turned back to the house, a sprawling structure of timber and stone that had once echoed with laughter and life. Now, it stood silent, except for the creaking of old wood and the whisper of wind through the eaves. The windows stared out like empty eyes, and the rooms inside held nothing but memories and dust. He'd built this place for Sarah, back when the world seemed full of possibilities. Every beam, every stone had been chosen with her in mind. The wide porch where she could watch the sunset, the kitchen with the big window facing east for morning light, the nursery they'd planned upstairs. Jack shook his head, banishing the thoughts as he always did. That life was gone, buried in the small cemetery on the hill behind the house. Sarah and little James, taken by fever in the space of a week 20 years ago. The same fever that had claimed half the settlement and left the survivors scattered like tumbleweeds. Since then, the Double Bar Ranch had been his entire world. He'd built it into the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, driven by a relentless need to keep moving, keep working, keep building walls, both literal and metaphorical, against the outside world. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. Jack went inside, his boots echoing on the hardwood floors. The house felt enormous around him, each room a reminder of the life he'd planned but never lived. In the kitchen, he heated a can of beans and ate standing up, looking out at the darkening plains. Somewhere out there, families were gathering around dinner tables. Children were being tucked into bed and couples were sharing the small intimacies of daily life. But here, in this house built for love and filled with silence, Jack Sullivan ate alone. As he prepared for bed, he went through his nightly ritual, checking the locks on all the doors, ensuring the windows were secure, and loading the rifle he kept by his bedside. The Double Bar Ranch was his sanctuary, but it was also his prison, and Jack Sullivan was both its king and its most devoted prisoner. The clock on the mantel chimed 11 times as he settled into bed. Outside, the wind picked up, howling across the plains like a lonesome coyote. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain and possibly something more. But Jack Sullivan slept the sleep of the isolated, unaware that this night would be different from all the others. Unaware that sometimes salvation comes not with fanfare and trumpets, but with 3 hesitant knocks on a door at midnight. Chapter 2. The Unexpected Visitor. The storm hit just after midnight, bringing with it a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Double Bar Ranch. Lightning split the sky like God's own whip, illuminating the landscape in stark, terrifying moments of clarity. Rain hammered against the windows with the persistence of bullets, and the wind howled like something alive and angry. Jack was already awake, sitting in his chair by the cold fireplace, listening to the storm's symphony. Sleep had become increasingly elusive over the years, and nights like these, when the weather reminded him of that terrible night 20 years ago, made rest impossible. He was reaching for his coffee cup when the sound came. Knock, knock, knock. 3 deliberate raps on the front door, barely audible above the storm, but unmistakable. Jack froze, his hand halfway to the cup. Nobody came to the Double Bar Ranch uninvited. Nobody came at all. He waited, thinking perhaps he'd imagined it. The wind could play tricks on a man's ears, especially during a storm like this. But then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, softer, more hesitant, almost desperate. Jack stood slowly, his joints protesting after years of hard living. He walked to the gun cabinet and took out his Winchester, checking the chamber out of habit. Whoever was out there in this storm had better have a damn good reason for disturbing his peace. The knocking came a third time, weaker now. as if the person on the other side was losing strength. Jack approached the door, his bare feet silent on the cold floor. Through the small window beside the door he could see nothing but darkness and rain. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice rough from disuse. No answer came, only the sound of the storm. Jack waited another moment, then slowly turned the lock and opened the door. The sight that greeted him stopped him cold. A woman stood on his porch, soaked to the bone and swaying on her feet. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair plastered to her face and eyes that held a mixture of fear and exhaustion. But it was her condition that made Jack's breath catch in his throat. She was heavily pregnant, her belly large and round beneath a thin, wet dress that offered little protection against the elements. She was shivering uncontrollably, her lips blue with cold, and when she looked up at him, tears mixed with the rain on her cheeks. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. I don't have anywhere else to go." For a moment Jack stood frozen, the rifle still in his hands. Every instinct told him to close the door, to send her away like he did everyone else. The Double Bar Ranch was his sanctuary, his refuge from the world and its complications. He didn't help strangers, he didn't get involved, but as he looked at her, really looked at her, he saw something that cut through his carefully constructed defenses. She reminded him of Sarah not in appearance but in the way she held herself, the quiet dignity even in desperation. And the child she carried? "I won't be trouble," she continued, her voice growing weaker. The baby's coming soon and I have nowhere to." Her words were cut short as her knees buckled. Jack moved without thinking, dropping the rifle and catching her before she could fall. She was lighter than he'd expected and cold, so terribly cold. "Jesus," he muttered, looking down at her unconscious form. The rain continued to pour down, soaking them both, and lightning illuminated the empty plains stretching endlessly in all directions. There was nowhere she could have come from, no town or settlement within 20 miles. For 20 years, Jack Sullivan had kept the world at bay. For 20 years he'd lived by one simple rule: no visitors, no exceptions. But as he looked down at the pregnant woman in his arms, something deep inside him, something he'd thought died with Sarah and James, stirred to life. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind him. The house suddenly felt different, no longer empty but filled with purpose. He laid her on the sofa in the living room, then quickly built up the fire, coaxing flames from the cold ashes. As the warmth began to fill the room, the woman's eyes fluttered open. They were green, he noticed, the color of spring grass after rain. She looked around in confusion, then remembered where she was. "I'm sorry," she said, trying to sit up. "I didn't mean to impose. I can go." "You're not going anywhere in this storm," Jack said firmly, surprising himself with the decisiveness in his voice. "Not in your condition." She looked at him with gratitude that made his chest tighten. "Thank you. I'm Mary Catherine." "Jack," he replied after a moment's hesitation. "Jack Sullivan. This is your ranch? The Double Bar?" He nodded, then realized she might have heard the stories. "You know about this place?" Mary managed a weak smile. "Everyone knows about the Double Bar, and about the man who built it. They say you don't take kindly to visitors." "They're right," Jack said, but there was no harshness in his voice. "So what brings you to my door at midnight, Mary Catherine?" Her smile faded, and she placed a protective hand on her belly. "I had nowhere else to go. My husband, he died 3 months ago. Fever. I've been staying with his sister in Fort Worth, but when she found out about the baby," she trailed off, the pain evident in her voice. "She threw you out," Jack guessed. Mary nodded. "Said she couldn't afford another mouth to feed. I've been traveling for days looking for work for anyone who might help, but nobody wants a pregnant woman with no family, no references." Jack studied her face, seeing the exhaustion and fear she was trying so hard to hide. "And you ended up here." "I was trying to reach the settlement at Bear Creek, but the storm, I got lost. Saw your lights in the distance." She looked around the room, taking in the sparse furnishings, the cold spaces that spoke of a life lived in isolation. "I know this is asking a lot, but could I stay just until the storm passes? I won't be any trouble, I promise." Jack looked at her for a long moment. The smart thing would be to put her on a horse at first light and send her on her way. The safe thing would be to maintain the walls he'd built around himself and his life. But as he watched her protective hand rest on her unborn child, he thought of Sarah and the baby they'd lost, and something inside him shifted. "The storm's not going anywhere tonight," he said finally. "There's a room upstairs. You can stay there." Relief flooded her face. "Thank you, I don't know how to repay you." "Don't thank me yet," Jack said gruffly, but there was no bite in his words. "Come on, let's get you dried off and warmed up." As he helped her to her feet, Jack Sullivan realized that for the first time in 20 years, his house didn't feel empty. And for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. Chapter 3. The walls come down. Dawn came slowly to the Texas plains. painting the sky in soft pastels that belied the fury of the night before. Jack stood at his kitchen window, watching the sun rise over land that was still his domain, still his sanctuary. But something had changed. The silence that had been his constant companion for 20 years now felt different, not peaceful, but expectant. Upstairs, Mary Catherine was still sleeping. He'd checked on her twice during the night, careful not to wake her but needing to make sure she was all right. Each time, he'd found her curled on her side, one hand protectively cradling her belly, her face peaceful in sleep. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and fresh. Puddles dotted the yard, and the distant mountains were clearer than they'd been in months. It was the kind of morning that usually filled Jack with a quiet satisfaction. His land, his peace, his solitude. But today, he found himself listening for sounds from upstairs. "Morning, boss." Miguel's voice came from the back door. "Hell of a storm last night. Lost a few fence posts on the south pasture, but nothing we can't handle." Jack turned from the window. "Good. Take a crew out there after breakfast." Miguel nodded, then paused. "Boss, I couldn't help but notice there's a horse tied up behind the barn. Looks like it's been ridden hard." Jack's jaw tightened. He'd completely forgotten about Mary's horse in the chaos of the night before. "It belongs to a guest." Miguel's eyebrows rose. In 15 years of working the double bar, he'd never known Jack Sullivan to have a guest. "A guest, boss?" "That's what I said," Jack replied curtly. "Get word to the men. Nobody mentions this to anyone off the ranch, understood?" "Yes, sir," Miguel said, but his curiosity was obvious. "This guest staying long?" "Just until she's back on her feet," Jack said, then realized his mistake. Miguel's expression shifted to one of barely concealed amazement. "She?" Before Jack could respond, the sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted their conversation. Mary Catherine appeared in the doorway, looking rested but still fragile. She'd managed to dry her hair and straighten her dress, but the exhaustion was still evident in her eyes. "Good morning," she said quietly, her gaze moving between Jack and Miguel. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, ma'am," Miguel said quickly, removing his hat. "Miguel Hernandez, foreman of the double bar. Welcome to our ranch." Mary smiled, the first genuine smile Jack had seen from her. "Thank you, Mr. Hernandez. I'm Mary Catherine. Just Miguel, please. And if you need anything at all, you just let me know." Jack watched the exchange with growing unease. This was exactly what he'd wanted to avoid. Complications, connections, people getting involved in his business. "Miguel has work to do," Jack said firmly. "Don't you, Miguel?" "Yes, sir," Miguel replied, but he shot Jack a look that clearly said they'd be having a conversation later. "Ma'am, it was a pleasure meeting you." After Miguel left, an awkward silence fell between Jack and Mary. She stood uncertainly in the doorway, clearly unsure of her welcome in the light of day. "I should go," she said finally. "I've imposed enough." "Where?" Jack asked bluntly. "Where exactly are you going to go?" Mary's hand moved to her belly. "I'll figure something out, I always do." "In your condition? With no money? No family? No job?" Jack shook his head. "You'll be dead before you reach the next settlement." The harsh words made Mary flinch, but Jack pressed on. "Sit down, I'll make breakfast." "You don't have to." "I said sit down." Mary sank into one of the kitchen chairs, watching as Jack moved around the kitchen with surprising efficiency. He cooked eggs and bacon, made coffee, and set out bread and jam. It was more food than he'd prepared in years, and certainly more than he'd shared with another person. "You don't talk much, do you?" Mary asked as they ate. "Not much need for conversation out here," Jack replied. "Must get lonely." Jack's hand stilled on his coffee cup. "I like the quiet." "I used to think I did too," Mary said softly. "Before I met Thomas, my husband, he was always talking, always laughing, drove me crazy at first, but after he died," she trailed off, staring out the window at the endless plains. "The quiet hurts sometimes." Jack found himself studying her face, noting the sadness that seemed to live just beneath the surface. "How long were you married?" 3 years. We met in Fort Worth. He was a school teacher, would you believe it? Thought he could make a difference. Educate the children, bring civilization to the frontier. She smiled sadly. He probably would have, given enough time. What happened to him? Same fever that's been hitting the settlements. Came on fast, took him faster. Mary's voice was steady, but Jack could see the pain in her eyes. "I was 3 months along when he died. Didn't even know I was pregnant yet. And his family? His sister was all he had left. She took me in, but..." Mary shrugged. "She's got her own problems. 6 children. Husband who drinks more than he works. When I started showing, she said she couldn't afford to feed another mouth, especially one that couldn't work." Jack felt a familiar anger building in his chest. "So she threw you out. She gave me $50 and a horse. Said it was more than she could spare." Mary's voice was matter-of-fact, but Jack could hear the hurt underneath. "I can't really blame her. Times are hard for everyone." "Still," Jack said grimly, throwing out a pregnant woman. "People do what they have to do to survive," Mary said simply. "I'm not bitter about it. I just need to figure out what comes next." They finished eating in silence, the weight of Mary's situation settling between them. Jack found himself thinking about the empty rooms upstairs, the silence that had been his companion for so long. He thought about Sarah and the children they'd never had, the life they'd planned but never lived. "You can stay," he said suddenly. Mary looked up, startled. "What? Until the baby comes. Until you're back on your feet. You can stay here. I can't ask you to." "You're not asking, I'm offering." Jack stood up, uncomfortable with the intensity of her gaze. "There's plenty of room, and Miguel's wife Rosa comes by twice a week to help with the cleaning. She'd be glad for the company." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "I don't understand. Yesterday you wouldn't even let a neighbor boy onto your property. Why are you helping me?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the plains he'd called home for so long. 20 years ago, I lost my wife and son to fever. Been living alone ever since. Maybe," he paused, struggling with words he hadn't spoken in decades. "Maybe it's time to stop running from the living." Mary reached across the table and touched his hand. Her fingers were warm, alive, real. "Thank you, Jack. You don't know what this means to me." Jack looked down at their joined hands, feeling something he'd thought was dead stirring back to life. "Don't thank me yet. I'm not easy to live with. Ask anyone. I'll take my chances," Mary said, smiling through her tears. As Jack helped her back upstairs to rest, he caught sight of himself in the hallway mirror. The man looking back at him was still weathered, still marked by years of solitude and grief, but something in his eyes had changed. For the first time in 20 years, Jack Sullivan didn't look like a man who was just surviving. He looked like a man who was beginning to live again. Chapter 4. The Birth of Hope. 3 weeks had passed since Mary Catherine's arrival at the Double Bar Ranch, and the change was remarkable. The house that had been a monument to silence and solitude now hummed with life. Mary had a gentle way of filling spaces, not with noise or chaos, but with presence. She hummed while she helped Rosa with the cleaning, asked thoughtful questions about the ranch operations, and somehow managed to coax Jack into conversations that lasted longer than his usual grunts and single-word responses. The transformation wasn't just in the house. Jack found himself looking forward to meals, to the quiet conversations that had become their routine. Mary had a way of listening that made him want to talk, and slowly, carefully, he began to share pieces of himself he'd kept buried for 20 years. "Tell me about her," Mary said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "About Sarah." Jack's hand stilled on his coffee cup. It had been so long since anyone had spoken his wife's name aloud. She was sunshine. Even on the coldest days, she could make this place feel warm. "How did you meet?" A small smile tugged at Jack's lips. "Church social in town. She was new to the area, come to live with her aunt after her parents died. I was this rough cowboy who barely knew how to tie his own necktie, and she was this refined lady from back east. Should never have worked. But it did," Mary said softly. "For a while. 7 years. Best 7 years of my life." Jack's voice grew quiet. "She wanted children so badly. We tried for 5 years before James came along, and then the fever took them both." Jack nodded, unable to speak. Mary reached over and touched his hand, offering comfort without words. "She would have liked you," Jack said finally. "Sarah always said this place was too quiet, that it needed more life in it. Maybe she sent me here," Mary said with a gentle smile, "to help you remember what life sounds like." Jack looked at her in the growing twilight, noting how the evening light caught the gold in her hair, how her hand rested protectively on her belly. The baby was due any day now, and Mary had grown more beautiful with each passing week, not just physically, but in some deeper way that Jack couldn't quite name. "Rosa says the baby's sitting lower now," Mary said, as if reading his thoughts. "She thinks it'll be soon." "Rosa's delivered more babies than the doctor in town," Jack said. "If she says soon, it'll be soon." That night, Jack lay in bed listening to the sounds of the house settling around him, but mixed with the familiar creaks and sighs was something new. The soft sound of Mary moving around upstairs, the gentle rhythm of life continuing. It was a sound he'd forgotten he'd missed. He was drifting off to sleep when he heard it, a sharp cry from upstairs, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Jack was out of bed and up the stairs before he was fully awake. He found Mary in her room, doubled over and gripping the bedpost, her face pale with pain. "It's time," she said through gritted teeth. "The baby's coming." Jack's mind went blank for a moment. He'd helped deliver countless calves and foals, but a human baby was different. This was Mary's baby, Mary's life at stake. "I'll get Rosa," he said, starting for the door. "No time," Mary gasped as another contraction hit. "It's happening fast." Jack forced himself to calm down, to think clearly. He'd been through this before with Sarah. He knew what to do, even if the memories were painful. "All right," he said, moving to her side. "Let's get you to the bed." The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation, encouragement, and the ancient dance of birth. Jack found himself falling into a rhythm he'd thought he'd forgotten. his hand steady despite the turmoil in his heart. Mary was strong, stronger than she looked, and she bore the pain with a quiet determination that reminded him of pioneer women he'd known. "I can see the head," Jack said, his voice filled with wonder. "Mary, you're almost there." With one final push, Mary brought her child into the world. The baby's cry filled the room, strong and healthy, and utterly perfect. Jack held the tiny form in his hands, this new life that had chosen to enter the world in his house under his protection. "It's a girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "A beautiful little girl." Mary collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but glowing with joy. Is she all right?" "She's perfect," Jack said, gently cleaning the baby before placing her in Mary's arms. "Absolutely perfect." As Mary cradled her daughter, Jack felt something shift inside him. Watching this woman hold this child, seeing the love and hope in her eyes, he was reminded of everything he'd lost, and everything he'd thought he'd never have again. "What will you name her?" he asked softly. Mary looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Sarah," she said, "Sarah Catherine, after your wife, and to honor the man who gave us sanctuary when we needed it most." Jack felt his composure crumble. 20 years of carefully controlled grief and isolation came crashing down, replaced by something he'd thought was dead forever: hope. He knelt beside the bed, looking at the baby who bore his wife's name, and for the first time in 2 decades, Jack Sullivan wept. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for bringing life back to this house." Mary reached out and touched his face gently. "Thank you for giving us a home." Outside, the sun was beginning to rise over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The Double Bar Ranch was waking up to a new day, and for the first time in 20 years, it was waking up to the sound of a baby's cry. Jack Sullivan, the man who had hated visitors and hidden from the world, found himself looking forward to the day ahead, because somewhere in the chaos of the night, he'd discovered something he'd thought was lost forever. He'd discovered that it was never too late to start living again. Chapter 5. Chapter 6. The Sound of Redemption. 6 months had passed since little Sarah Catherine came into the world, and the Double Bar Ranch was transformed. The house that had been a fortress of solitude now rang with laughter and life. Baby Sarah's cries and coos filled the spaces that had been silent for so long, and Mary's gentle presence had turned the austere ranch house into a home. Jack stood on the porch in the early morning light, watching Mary hang laundry on the line while baby Sarah slept in a basket nearby. The sight filled him with a contentment he'd thought he'd never feel again. Mary hummed as she worked, the same tune she'd been humming the day she arrived, and the sound seemed to dance on the morning breeze. "Boss?" Miguel approached, his hat in his hands and a knowing smile on his face. "The Henderson boy is at the gate again, but this time he's not alone. Looks like half the county's out there." Jack frowned. "What do they want?" "Word's gotten out about Miss Mary and the baby. Folks are bringing gifts wanting to welcome them to the community." Miguel paused. "They're asking if they can come up to the house." For a moment, Jack felt the old instinct to refuse, to send them away like he had for 20 years. But then he heard Sarah's gurgling laugh and saw Mary wave to him from the clothesline, and he realized that the walls he'd built around himself had already come down. "Open the gate," he said quietly. "Let them come." Miguel's smile widened. "Yes, sir. About time, if you ask me." As the procession of neighbors and townspeople made their way up the long drive, Jack felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Mary came up onto the porch carrying baby Sarah and slipped her hand into his. "You sure about this?" she asked softly. Jack looked down at the baby in her arms, at the woman who had brought light back into his life, and nodded. "Yeah, I'm sure." The first to reach the porch was Mrs. Henderson, her arms full of baby clothes and her face beaming with joy. "Jack Sullivan, it's about time you let us come visit properly. This little one is absolutely beautiful." "She looks just like her mama," said Tom Bradley, the town's blacksmith, tipping his hat to Mary. "Welcome to the county, ma'am. We're honored to have you." One by one, the neighbors came forward with gifts and well wishes. Mrs. Patterson brought a hand-knitted blanket. The Morrison family offered fresh vegetables from their garden, and even the stern-faced preacher, Reverend Williams, had a gentle smile for the baby. "Jack," the Reverend said, taking his aside, "I've been praying for 20 years that you'd find your way back to the community. I'm grateful to see those prayers answered." "Don't give me too much credit, Reverend," Jack replied. "It wasn't me who found the way back, it was them." He nodded toward Mary and Sarah. As the afternoon wore on, Jack found himself doing something he hadn't done in decades: entertaining guests. He showed the men around the ranch, discussing cattle prices and weather patterns, while Mary and the women gathered in the kitchen, sharing recipes and stories. "You know," said Jim Morrison, leaning against the porch railing with a cup of coffee in his hands, "I always wondered what it would take to get you to open these gates again. Never thought it would be a woman and a baby." Jack glanced over at Mary, who was showing little Sarah to a group of admiring women. The baby gurgled happily, her tiny fists waving in the air. "Sometimes life surprises you," he said simply. "That it does," agreed Dr. William Hayes, the town physician who had ridden out specifically to check on Mary and the baby. "Both mother and child are in excellent health, Jack. You did good work that night." "Rosa did most of it," Jack replied, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just helped where I could." "Don't sell yourself short," Dr. Hayes said with a knowing smile. "Takes a special kind of man to open his home to a stranger in need. Takes an even more special kind to deliver a baby and help raise it as his own." The words hit Jack harder than he expected. As his own. He hadn't thought of it in those terms, but watching Sarah grow over the past 6 months, seeing her first smile, hearing her first laugh, helping Mary through the sleepless nights, it had felt natural, right? Like this was how it was supposed to be. "Jack," Mary's voice called from across the porch, "could you hold Sarah for a moment? Mrs. Patterson wants to show me her knitting pattern." Jack took the baby without hesitation, cradling her against his chest. Sarah looked up at him with bright blue eyes. Thomas's eyes, Mary had said, and reached for his weathered face with her tiny hands. The men around him smiled at the sight. "She's got you wrapped around her little finger," chuckled Tom Bradley. "Never seen a man change so much in such a short time." "Change how?" Jack asked, though he knew the answer. "You're human again," said Jim Morrison bluntly. "For 20 years you've been like a ghost haunting this place. Now look at you, holding a baby, entertaining neighbors, actually smiling. It's like watching a man come back from the dead." Jack considered this as he gently bounced Sarah in his arms. The baby made soft cooing sounds, completely content in his embrace. "Maybe I was dead," he said quietly. "Maybe I just didn't know it." As the afternoon wore on, Jack found himself drawn into conversations he'd avoided for 2 decades. He discussed the drought with the farmers, shared advice about cattle breeding with the ranchers, and even found himself laughing at Tom Bradley's stories about his mishaps at the forge. "You should come to the church social next month," suggested Mrs. Henderson as the gathering began to wind down. "Mary and the baby would love it, and it would do you good to get out more." Jack's first instinct was to refuse, but then he caught Mary's hopeful expression. "We'll see," he said, which was as close to a yes as anyone had heard from him in 20 years. As the last of the visitors departed, Jack and Mary found themselves alone on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Sarah slept peacefully in Mary's arms, exhausted from all the attention. "That was wonderful," Mary said softly. "Your neighbors are good people." "They are," Jack agreed. "I forgot that for a while." "What made you remember?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. "You," he said finally. "You and Sarah. You reminded me what it felt like to be part of something bigger than myself." Mary shifted the baby to one arm and took Jack's hand with her free hand. "I've been thinking about something," she said carefully. "About what comes next." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I can't stay here forever, Jack. Sarah and we're not really your responsibility. You've done so much for us already, more than anyone had a right to expect. But I need to think about building a life for us, finding work, making our own way." "Where would you go?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know. Maybe back to Fort Worth, see if I can find work as a seamstress or a cook. Maybe try to teach school like Thomas did." Mary's voice was uncertain, and Jack could tell she was struggling with the decision. "And if you can't find work? If no one will hire a woman with a baby?" Mary's grip on his hand tightened. "I'll figure something out. I always do." Jack stood up abruptly, pacing to the edge of the porch. The thought of Mary and Sarah leaving felt like a physical pain in his chest. Over the past 6 months, they had become the center of his world. The house would be empty without Mary's humming, silent without Sarah's cries and laughter. "Stay," he said suddenly, turning back to face her. "Jack, stay, both of you. This is your home now." Jack's voice was rough with emotion. "I know I'm not much to look at, and I know I'm set in my ways, but I can provide for you. I can give Sarah everything she needs to grow up strong and healthy." Mary looked at him with tears in her eyes. "You're asking me to stay out of obligation?" "No," Jack said, kneeling down beside her chair. "I'm asking you to stay because I love you, both of you. I love Sarah like she's my own daughter, and I love you like," he struggled for the words, "like I never thought I'd love anyone again." The admission hung in the air between them, vulnerable and honest. Mary reached out and touched his face gently. "Oh, Jack," she whispered, "I love you too. I have for months now, but I didn't know if you felt the same way, or if you were just being kind to a woman in need." "I stopped being kind the day I realized I didn't want you to leave," Jack said, covering her hand with his. "I stopped being kind the day I realized that you and Sarah had become my family." Mary leaned forward and kissed him gently. It was a kiss full of promise and hope, a kiss that sealed the bond that had been growing between them for months. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes, we'll stay. We'll be your family." 1 year later, the Double Bar Ranch buzzed with activity. as preparations for the wedding continued. Mary had insisted on a simple ceremony, but the entire county had other ideas. It seemed that everyone within 50 miles wanted to celebrate the union of Jack Sullivan and Mary Catherine, the woman who had tamed the legendary cattle baron. Jack stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom, struggling with his tie. His hands, which could rope a steer and deliver a calf with steady precision, seemed incapable of managing the simple knot. "Let me help you with that," said Miguel, appearing in the doorway with a grin. "Can't have the groom looking like he got dressed in the dark. I don't know why we need all this fuss," Jack grumbled as Miguel fixed his tie. "Could have just gone to the preacher quietly." "Because the whole county wants to celebrate with you," Miguel replied. "Besides, Miss Mary deserves a proper wedding. She's been planning this for months." Through the window, Jack could see the preparations in full swing. Tables had been set up in the yard, laden with food brought by neighbors from miles around. A small platform had been built for the ceremony, decorated with wildflowers that Mary and some of the local women had gathered that morning. "Boss," Miguel said seriously, "I've worked for you for 15 years. I've seen you at your worst and your best, but I've never seen you as happy as you've been this past year." Jack looked at his foreman, this man who had been his most constant companion through the lonely years. "Thank you, Miguel, for everything, for staying, for understanding, for helping me find my way back." "You found your own way back," Miguel said. "Miss Mary and little Sarah just gave you a reason to want to." A knock at the door interrupted them. "Come in," Jack called. Dr. Hayes entered, carrying a small bundle in his arms. "Someone wants to see your papa before the ceremony," he said with a smile. Jack's heart swelled as he took 18-month-old Sarah into his arms. She was walking now, getting into everything, and had recently started calling him Papa Jack in her sweet, lisping voice. She looked adorable in her little white dress, her dark hair tied with a yellow ribbon. "Papa," she said, reaching for his face with her chubby hands. "Pretty. You're the pretty one, sweetheart," Jack said, kissing her forehead. "Are you ready to watch Mama and Papa get married?" Sarah nodded solemnly, though Jack doubted she understood what was happening. To her, this was just another day when lots of people came to visit and there was lots of food and attention. "It's time," announced Rosa, appearing in the doorway. "Everyone's ready." Jack took a deep breath and looked at himself in the mirror one last time. The man looking back at him was different from the one who had opened his door to a pregnant stranger 18 months ago. This man's eyes held warmth instead of ice, hope instead of despair. This man was alive. He carried Sarah downstairs and outside to where the ceremony was to take place. The entire county seemed to be there. Neighbors, townsfolk, even some of the cowboys from neighboring ranches. Reverend Williams stood at the makeshift altar, his Bible in hand and a broad smile on his face. And then Jack saw Mary. She stood at the back of the crowd, radiant in a simple white dress that Rosa had helped her make. Her hair was swept back in an elegant style, and she carried a bouquet of the same wildflowers that decorated the platform, but it was her smile that took Jack's breath away, a smile of pure joy and love that seemed to light up the entire gathering. As the crowd parted to let him through, Jack felt a peace settle over him that he had never experienced before. This was right. This was how it was supposed to be. He handed Sarah to Rosa and took his place beside Reverend Williams, watching as Mary walked toward him. She moved with quiet grace, her eyes never leaving his face, and when she reached him, she took his hands in hers. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Williams began, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Jack Sullivan and Mary Catherine in holy matrimony. This is a day of celebration, not just for this couple, but for all of us who have watched them find love and hope in each other." Jack barely heard the words. He was lost in Mary's eyes, in the promise he saw there, in the future that stretched out before them. When it came time for the vows, he spoke from his heart. "Mary," he said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd, 18 months ago, you knocked on my door and changed my life forever. You brought light into my darkness, love into my emptiness, and hope into my despair. I promise to love you and Sarah with everything I have, to protect you both, to provide for you, and to never again close my heart to the gift of love." Mary's vows were equally heartfelt. "Jack, you gave me sanctuary when I had nowhere else to go. You gave my daughter a father and me a home. You showed me that love can bloom even in the hardest soil, that hope can survive even the darkest night. I promise to love you, to stand by you, to build a life with you that honors the love we've found." When Reverend Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd erupted in cheers. Jack kissed his bride as Sarah clapped her hands in delight from Rosa's arms, and for the first time in 20 years the Double Bar Ranch was filled with celebration. The reception lasted well into the evening. There was dancing and laughter, stories and toasts, and more food than Jack had seen in one place since before Sarah and James died. He found himself in the middle of it all, no longer the isolated cattle baron, but a man celebrating with his community, his family, his new life. "Speech!" called out Tom Bradley as the evening wound down. The groom needs to make a speech. Jack stood up reluctantly, uncomfortable with being the center of attention. The crowd fell silent, waiting expectantly. He looked around at all the faces, neighbors who had waited 20 years for him to come back to the world, friends who had never given up on him, and finally at Mary, who sat beside him with Sarah on her lap. "I'm not much of a speaker," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Most of you know I'm better with cattle than I am with words, but I wanted to say something about what this day means to me." He paused, gathering his thoughts. 20 years ago, I lost everything that mattered to me. I thought that was the end of my story. I closed the gates of this ranch and closed my heart to the world. I thought I was protecting myself from more pain, but all I was doing was protecting myself from life. The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. Then one night, in the middle of a storm, a pregnant woman knocked on my door. She was scared, alone, and desperate. I should have sent her away like I sent everyone else away, but something about her, maybe it was the way she looked at me, maybe it was the child she carried, maybe it was just God's way of giving me one more chance, made me open that door. Jack's voice grew stronger. Mary and Sarah didn't just give me a family, they gave me back my life. They reminded me that love is stronger than fear, that hope is stronger than despair, and that sometimes the greatest courage is simply the courage to let people in. He looked around at the faces of his neighbors, people he'd shut out for so long. "I know I wasn't a good neighbor for 20 years. I know I built walls when I should have built bridges, but if you'll have me, I'd like to try to be part of this community again. I'd like to be the man that Mary and Sarah see when they look at me." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Men who had been turned away from his gates for decades came forward to shake his hand. Women who had been rebuffed when they tried to reach out after Sarah's death embraced him warmly. "Welcome back, Jack," said Jim Morrison, clasping him on the shoulder. "We've missed you." "We all have," agreed Mrs. Henderson. "This county wasn't the same without you." As the evening finally wound down and the last guests departed, Jack found himself alone on the porch with his new family. Mary sat in the rocking chair with Sarah sleeping in her arms, and Jack stood beside them, his hand resting on his wife's shoulder. "Regrets?" Mary asked softly. Jack looked out over the plains that stretched endlessly in all directions, then down at the woman and child who had become his world. "Not a one," he said firmly. "For the first time in 20 years, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "We all are," Mary said, reaching up to squeeze his hand. "We all are." As the night settled over the Double Bar Ranch, Jack Sullivan, husband, father, and man reborn, listened to the sounds of his new life, the gentle breathing of his sleeping daughter, the soft rustle of Mary's dress as she rocked, the distant lowing of cattle in the fields, and underneath it all, the steady rhythm of his own heart, beating with hope and love and the promise of tomorrow. The man who had hated visitors had learned that sometimes salvation comes not with fanfare and trumpets, but with 3 hesitant knocks on a door at midnight. And in that learning, he had found not just love but redemption, the kind that comes not from changing the past, but from embracing the future. The Double Bar Ranch was no longer a fortress of solitude. It was a home, filled with laughter and love and the sweet sound of second chances. And in the years that followed, when travelers spoke of the legendary cattle baron who had once shut out the world, they would tell a different story. The story of a man who had learned that the greatest strength lies not in building walls but in having the courage to tear them down. The story of Jack Sullivan, the cattle baron who hated visitors until a crying pregnant woman knocked at his door at midnight and taught him that love, like hope, is stronger than fear. The end.